poetry analysis. Specifically, unseen poetry is often one of the hardest parts of the literature exam, and also the part of the exam that people are most scared of, because you've got no idea what the poem is going to be. You probably struggled anyway analysing the poems that you actually went through in class. So now you're left by yourself. You're on your own in this exam, trying to work out what the hell is going on in this poem. So in this video, I'm going to go over what the common mistakes can be with poetry analysis, and tips and steps on how to get more from a poem, how to understand the story, work out what the poet is writing about, and find some really useful techniques to analyze. So stick with me through this. We can do it. Here we go. Okay, so let's go through this. Unseen poetry. Why is it so hard? Why is it so hard? Well, generally people struggle with working out what the story is. It's often very metaphorical, complicated, and it can sometimes be hard to just work out, like, what is the story here? What are we doing here? What is going on? So stories, working out what the main story is often really difficult. And because of that, if you don't really know what's going on in the poem, you sort of feel a little bit lost, and you can really start to panic very, very quickly. So we're going to have a little look at that. Often finding techniques can be really, really difficult. So we're going to go through that, particularly form techniques, which is a set of techniques which are unique only to poetry, which sometimes teachers at schools are really bad at teaching. Like when I work with a lot of students from lots of different schools, when we come onto form, a lot of them will just be like, what is form? I literally never heard of this word, but it's actually in the mark scheme. We need to know about it. And we need to know what we're supposed to write about and what we need to say in order to get marks, which of course I'll go through with you as well. So how should I tackle a poem? Okay, I'm going to break it down into 4 parts. There are 4 things you need to do in poetry analysis to give you a good chance of picking up some marks. So the first thing is actually interpretation, trying to interpret what is going on in this poem. So this is all about understanding what the poet's ideas are in the poem and what they're trying to say in their poem. Also consider what the story is within the poem, because they always have a story, or at least they always have a message that we've got to try and unpick and uncover. Next up, language techniques. And on this point, a lot of people go slightly wrong in that they think if I just find a technique and write about it, I'll get a mark. That's only half the battle. What you've actually got to do is find a technique, write about it, but then link it in to your interpretation. Link it into what you think the story is or what the message of the poem is. And obviously make sure your techniques actually help you answer the specific question they gave you. It's an area that a lot of people actually go wrong with. Structure techniques, exactly the same. You've got to find specific techniques, but then be able to craftily link it into actually what the message of the poem is. And then finally, form techniques. These are techniques that are unique to poems, right? You wouldn't see these particular techniques used on, like, say, a language paper, for example. These are only unique to poems. Like, for example, rhyme scheme, right? Like, you wouldn't be doing language paper 1 and be looking for rhyme, because you know that, like, language paper 1 or component 1, whatever your exam board calls it, they are pieces of prose. They're extracts from a book. They're not going to have rhyme in them. Now, on this, what the hell is form? Now, I get told this a lot when I start going through form techniques like rhyme scheme and stanzas, rhythm and things like that. And students go, oh, what, you mean structure? No, I don't mean structure, because if you know the mark scheme, and if you've watched one of my videos on language analysis that's on the channel, you will have seen that I go through the mark scheme for an AO2 question on the language papers. And you'll always see the words language and structure. You never see the word form, because it doesn't exist on the language papers. So when a teacher says, oh yeah, rhyme scheme, that comes under structure, it can't come under structure, because otherwise it's something we would look for in the language paper. And when you actually look at the literature mark scheme, you will see the word form used all of a sudden. Like, it comes out of nowhere. We never saw it on the language papers. And then when you look at the literature paper for AO2, it says analyze language, structure, and form. This word form appears because this is the word that we associate with literature, and particularly with poetry as well. And how do we write about these techniques? Well, I'm going to go through all of these now. So first up, rhyme scheme. This is probably one of the easier ones to find. Rhyme is something we tend to learn pretty early on in school. So hopefully you're pretty confident with finding rhyme. It's simply finding a pattern which follows in the final word of a line. Stanzas. Stanzas are the equivalent of like a paragraph in an extract from a book. So there's got to be a line, a space in between the lines of the stanza in order for it to be a stanza. It's not like if the writer has one line where they've only got sort of one word rather than like 10 words in the line above. That doesn't make it a stanza. There's got to be a clear gap, just like you would with a paragraph. Rhythm. Great one to analyze, sometimes quite a hard one to find. So this is all about the flow of words across the line in a poem. And it's really actually quite simple to work out. All you've got to do is count the syllables in the line and see if there's a pattern with any of the other lines. And the most common one that hopefully you've heard of, but surprisingly a lot of people haven't, because you will have looked at this technique most likely with your Shakespeare analysis as well. But it's something called iambic pentameter, which is when specifically 10 syllables are used in a line. So across all of the words in that line, there are 10 syllables. Now, you're right, your teacher may have gone into more depth and said things like there's an unstressed and a stressed syllable. You don't actually need to know that, to be honest. You would never really write about what particular syllable is stressed in a word, really. The most important thing to note is that 10 syllables in a line is a very powerful, very strong rhythm. And that's really what you want to write about. No one really cares about stressed and unstressed syllables. Free verse is the name for a poem where there is no rhyme and there's no rhythm. And generally it gives this sense of like freedom or chaos to the poem, because you don't have anything rigid, anything holding this poem together like a set rhythm or a rhyme scheme. It's quite good to analyze. And in fact, if you're doing the AQA exam board, for some reason, I don't know why, on the unseen section C of literature paper 2, they generally use unseen poems. They generally use, and if you're doing AQA, on section C, the unseen poetry section of literature paper 2, generally they tend to use free verse poems. I don't know why, that's just kind of their thing. With the other exam boards, not so much. They'll tend to put a bit more variety, but particularly with AQA, really look out for free verse in the poems. Blank verse is actually fairly uncommon. There's a couple of poems in the anthologies generally that are written in blank verse. Quite hard to analyze, so I kind of tend to not bother with it. But blank verse is when there is no rhyme, but there is rhythm. So really the only thing you're going to be analysing with blank verse is the fact that there is a rhythm to it. You're generally not going to analyse a poem that doesn't have a rhyme scheme to it. It's quite hard to say what the effect on the reader is of no rhyme scheme, but there is rhythm. This is quite hard to analyse that. Caesura, it's one of my favourite techniques. This is when there is hard punctuation in the middle of a line. Piece of hard punctuation to look out for would be a full stop, exclamation mark, or a question mark. If we're getting super technical, nerdy, a comma or a semicolon or a colon can count as caesura, or a dash could count as caesura in a line. But they're not as powerful or impactful as a piece of hard punctuation that's designed to stop you dead and break the flow of that line. So to be honest, I don't bother analysing a piece of caesura in a line unless it's that hard punctuation, because then it feels something deliberate. It feels something that is powerful and designed to really stop us in our track. So those are much more worthwhile analysing. I would kind of leave commas or anything that's a half pause in a line. I would just leave that to one side. I wouldn't analyse it. Enjambment. Again, this is a kind of tricky one because technically you can have an enjambed line, which is where there is no hard punctuation at the end of a line. So, if there's a comma at the end of a line, that is technically an enjambed line. However, again, I don't bother analysing these. I don't teach any of my students to bother analysing enjambment just between lines. The reason is it's super common. That you could look at a poem and be like, oh, that's an enjambed line, and that's an enjambed line, that's an enjambed line. There'll be more enjambed lines with enjambment than without, with full stops. So there's absolutely no point analysing it because it's just so common. You'd have to really be able to work out what the specific effect with that enjambed line that you want to analyse is, which is just really hard. So it's much more interesting when it is stanza to stanza. So what I mean by that is the last line of a stanza, if that is enjambed, meaning it just has a comma or a colon, semicolon, anything that's not hard punctuation like a full stop, exclamation mark or question mark, if that stanza ends without that hard punctuation, that is interesting because it's super rare and it's much more of a deliberate choice from the writer to do that. And of course, it speeds up the poem. It doesn't give you a chance to have a break. It makes you drive on through to the next stanza. So generally with enjambment, I would just tend to focus on enjambment that happens at the end of stanzas. Much more rare, much more interesting. Anaphora or anaphora, however you want to say it. This is where you've got two or more lines that start with the same words or pattern of words. Fairly common, if I'm honest, in poetry and great to analyse because it's just a form of repetition. And repetition is generally quite easy to analyse, just emphasises those words or emphasises that particular part of the stanza. So quite good to analyse. I quite like anaphora. So a step-by-step guide to tackling a poem. I think this is really important, this part actually, because a lot of people just kind of don't know where to start. So here we go. Step 1, read the whole poem all the way through. First line to the last line. Don't stop to make any notes because they're super short. It's not like reading the extract of a language paper. I generally would never say to any students, just read the whole text first and then read it again and do all your notes. You just don't have time to do that. These are like 40, 50 line extracts. Poems are always way shorter. You can read a poem in 20 to 30 seconds. So it's not like you're losing any time by just giving yourself time to just read it, chill out, like try and have a think about what's the story, what's the imagery going on, things like that. So read the poem all the way through. Don't stop to make notes. And then once you have read it through, at the bottom of the poem, just write down what you think the key ideas or what the key themes might be. So this could be things like darkness, an idea of love, or something like that. Try and write down some themes because that gives you a really strong element to tie your techniques to. Right at the beginning, I said you want to analyze techniques that link in with the message of the poem or the ideas of the poem. So you've got to find the ideas or the themes in order to actually kind of link any techniques to them. So finding some ideas is quite important. Third step, read the poem again. So this will be the second time reading it. You've read it once, you've written down some ideas and themes, and don't worry if you couldn't find any, because often when you read it a second and then a third time, the ideas might become a little bit clearer for you. So read it that second time, and this time is all about picking out the language techniques. Don't worry about structure, don't worry about form. Focus purely on language. So that should be the easiest bit of analysis you do on the poem, picking out things that we're quite comfortable generally with picking out, things like similes, metaphor, personification, hyperbole, alliteration, etc. And then step 4, the final read. Not saying like you can only read it 3 times. You can read it as many times as you want, but generally I try and get it done in 3 reads so that I can actually get on with start planning the answer or starting to actually answer the question. On that third read, the third time of reading it, I'm looking for my form and I'm looking for my structure techniques as well. So, top tips. think about who the speaker is. Think about like who is the central character to this story. Generally there will be one, there won't always be one, but even if you think to your anthology text, I don't know which anthology booklet you're doing of poems, but I bet the majority of them, if you really think about it, they have a central character, generally what we call the speaker, who's communicating their thoughts and their ideas and stuff like that. And really just ask yourself a couple of questions. Things like, what are they feeling? What is the emotion that comes across from the speaker in this poem? That's going to give you something to write about, and that comes under interpretation. Ask yourself what's happened to them in the poem. Like, what are the events that take place and what's really going on for them? What is the setting and is it important in the poem? Some poems, setting is really, really important. I bet you there are loads of poems in your anthology where setting is kind of the main part of it. And they're often really, really important parts to poems and good to analyse. So have a look out for the setting. Just ask yourself, is it important? And if it is, why is it important? What are they trying to communicate through the setting? And lastly, are there any big, bold themes? Kind of like I was talking about earlier with picking out those ideas or themes. Things like love, nature, loss, family, relationships. You're looking for one word that almost like encapsulates all the main topics or talking points of that particular poem. When you think about it, all of the anthologies that we are given are all split into sort of love and relationships, power and conflict, time and place. That actually tells you what the main ideas or themes are going to be within those poems. So try and think of it in the same way. When you read an unseen poem, just ask yourself, like, what category would this fit into? Is it a love poem? Is it a poem about relationships? Is it a poem about power? Is it a war poem? Does it have conflict in it? Think of it like that, because then that can really help you try and work out what are the central parts to this poem that I can then try and link my techniques to. And there we go, guys. 4 really important parts that you have to do in poetry analysis: interpretation, language techniques, structure techniques, and form techniques. Trying to tie all of that together with those interpretations, what you think the story is, what you think the message is, and what's going on for this character. And another important thing to think about on that interpretation part is don't be worried about getting it right. And the reason for that is poems are kind of designed to be taken in whatever way you take them. And what that means is that the examiner isn't really marking you on whether they agree with your interpretation or whether you interpreted it the same way as them. They're not really interested in that. What they're interested in is, have you presented your interpretation in a really solid way? Have you backed up your interpretations with quotes? Have you linked it to your techniques? Because then that becomes a much more secure interpretation. So don't worry about what is right and what is wrong. Don't let that put you off. Just make an interpretation, stick with it, and just present it and explain it in the clearest way possible. And the examiner will award you marks. So thanks very much for watching. If you found it useful, please do subscribe to the channel, leave a like on the video, and check out some of the other videos I've got on the channel. Particularly, I really would recommend looking at my podcast, which I record with top grade students who are currently in year 11 or year 12 or year 13. And they'll offer really useful advice on how they got grade 9s at GCSE, how they're getting A stars at A level as well. So do check those videos out, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.